waiting on God positions you for the right timing. There is something powerful about knowing when to move and when to be still. Too many people rush ahead, anxious to make things happen on their own, only to find themselves struggling in places they were never meant to be. But when you wait on God, you position yourself for the exact moment. His timing is not just about when things happen. It's about making sure that when you step forward, everything is aligned for your success. Think about David. He was anointed as king when he was just a shepherd boy, but he didn't take the throne immediately. He had to wait. And in that waiting, God was preparing him, teaching him, molding him, and strengthening him for the responsibility that was coming. If David had rushed the process, he might have forced his way into a position that he wasn't ready for. But because he waited, he stepped into the throne at the right time, in the right way, under God's favor. Some of you are in a season where you feel ready to move. You're tired of waiting, tired of the process, tired of seeing others move forward while you feel stuck. But God's delay is not a denial, it's a setup. He is aligning things behind the scenes that you cannot see. He is working out details, shifting circumstances, and ensuring that when you step forward, you step into something greater than what you would have created on your own. Abraham and Sarah learned this the hard way. God promised them a son, but when the years passed and nothing happened, they decided to take matters into their own hands. Instead of waiting on God's timing, they tried to force the promise, and as a result, they created unnecessary struggle. The son they birthed outside of God's plan brought division, heartache, and conflict that lasted for generations, all because they didn't wait. When you try to move before God, you risk stepping into battles you weren't meant to fight. You find yourself carrying burdens that were never meant for you. You struggle in places where God never intended for you to be. But when you wait, when you trust his timing, you walk into doors that only he can open. There is a season for everything, a time to be still and a time to move. But the difference between success and struggle is knowing who is directing your steps. If you move on your own, you rely on your own strength. But when you wait for God, you move in his power. And when God is leading, favor goes before you, protection surrounds you, and provision follows you. Some of you are wrestling with impatience right now. You're asking God, when? How much longer? But instead of focusing on the waiting, focus on the preparation. Let God do his work in you. Let him refine your character, build your faith, and strengthen your foundation. Because when the right time comes, you won't have to force it. Moving without God leads to chaos. When we step ahead of his plan, when we rush into decisions without his direction, we set ourselves up for unnecessary struggle. Impatience will always cost you something. It will cost you peace, wisdom, and sometimes even the very thing you were praying for. Because when we try to force doors open before their time, we often end up walking into places we were never meant to be. Look at Saul, the first king of Israel. God had anointed him, set him apart, and positioned him for greatness. But when Saul found himself in a moment of pressure, waiting for the prophet Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice, he let impatience override obedience. Instead of waiting for God's appointed servant, he took matters into his own hands and made the sacrifice himself. And in that one moment of disobedience, he lost the favor of God. His kingdom, which was supposed to be established forever, was now destined to fall. All because he moved before God. How many times do we do the same thing? How many times do we rush into relationships that God never approved, force job opportunities that were never meant for us, or make decisions out of fear instead of faith? And then, when things fall apart, we wonder what went wrong. The truth is, when we act without God, we invite chaos into our lives. Confusion takes over. Doors that were once open begin to close. And we end up carrying burdens that God never intended for us to bear. The enemy loves to tempt us into moving ahead of God because he knows that when we operate outside of God's will, we become vulnerable. We make choices based on emotions instead of wisdom. We settle for less when God had something greater. We step into battles that could have been avoided altogether. But when we wait on God's direction, we step into his divine protection. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness. God had promised them the land of Canaan, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of blessing and abundance. But when they got to the edge of their promise, fear took over. Instead of trusting God's word, they listened to the report of the spies who said, "The land is good, but the giants are too strong." And because they doubted, because they hesitated, instead of moving when God told them to, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That's what happens when we move without God, or when we refuse to move when he says go. We either run into unnecessary battles or we delay our blessing. But here's the good news. God's mercy is still present even when we get ahead of him. If you've made mistakes, if you've stepped into something before you should have, God can still redeem it. Because when he leads, you walk into victory. When you step in his timing, doors open supernaturally. And when you trust his process, you won't have to chase blessings. Blessings will chase you. God's delay is not denial, it's preparation. Too often, we mistake waiting for rejection as if God's silence means he has forgotten about us. But what if the waiting is actually the setup? What if the time between your prayer and your promise is the very thing that is shaping you for what's next? God is not making you wait to frustrate you. He is making you wait to prepare you. Joseph had a dream as a young man that he would one day be in a position of power, but his reality didn't match his revelation. Instead of stepping into leadership immediately, he was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and falsely accused. It looked like delay, but it was actually development. Every trial Joseph faced was molding him into the man he needed to be. Had he stepped into his dream too soon, he wouldn't have been ready. But because he endured the process, when the time came, he wasn't just promoted, he was positioned by God's hand. Some of you are frustrated because it feels like God has hit the pause button on your life. You're praying, you're believing, but nothing is happening. And the enemy is whispering in your ear. Maybe God changed his mind. Maybe the promise isn't for you. Maybe you miss your moment. But I came to tell you today, the promise is still alive. The waiting is not wasted. God is not just preparing the blessing for you. He is preparing you for the blessing. When a farmer plants a seed, he doesn't dig it up every day to see if it's growing. He trusts the process. He waters it, he nurtures it, and he waits for the right season for it to sprout. Just because you can see movement doesn't mean growth isn't happening beneath the surface. Some breakthroughs take time because they require a foundation strong enough to sustain them. God is not interested in giving you something that will break you. He wants to make sure you can handle it. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading the Israelites out of Egypt. David spent years tending sheep before he ever sat on the throne. Even Jesus himself waited until the appointed time to begin his ministry. If God made them wait, why do we think we should be any different? You have to stop seeing delays as a punishment and start seeing them as preparation. God is developing something inside of you that cannot be rushed. The skills, the wisdom, the character, the strength, it's all part of the process. And when the right moment comes, you won't have to force it. You won't have to beg for it. You won't have to manipulate it. It will happen because God has ordained it. So don't grow weary in the waiting. Keep trusting, keep believing, and keep preparing. Because when God moves, it will happen suddenly. And when he opens the door, Nothing and no one will be able to shut it. Trusting God requires letting go of control. And that's hard, isn't it? Because deep down we want to know how things will work out. We want to see the blueprint, the timeline, the exact steps before we move. But faith doesn't work like that. Faith is trusting that even when you can't see the whole picture, there's something in us that struggles with surrender. We say we trust God, but then we try to fix things on our own. We try to manipulate outcomes, force doors open, or hold on to things that God is trying to remove. And when it doesn't go the way we planned, we panic. But let me ask you, if you truly trust God, why are you still trying to control it? Abraham and Sarah had to learn this the hard way. God promised them a son. But when time passed and nothing happened, they took matters into their own hands. Sarah told Abraham to have a child with her servant Hagar, thinking that maybe she could help God's plan along. But what she created was not the promise, it was a problem. That decision brought division, heartache, and consequences that lasted for generations. And in the end, God still did what he said he would do. He gave them Isaac, the son of the promise. But if they had just trusted him in the first place, they could have avoided so much unnecessary pain. That's what happens when we refuse to surrender. We create burdens that we weren't meant to carry. We fight battles that we were never supposed to be in. And instead of walking in peace, we walk in stress, fear, and exhaustion. But God is saying today, let go. Stop trying to control what is not yours to control. Stop trying to fix what only I can fix. Stop trying to force something that I have not ordained. Peter had to learn this lesson too. When the disciples were caught in a storm, Jesus came walking on the water. And Peter, full of faith, said, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. And Jesus said, come. So Peter stepped out of the boat, and as long as his eyes were on Jesus, he walked on water. But the moment he focused on the storm, he started sinking. What changed? The storm was there the whole time, but when Peter shifted his focus from Jesus to his circumstances, he lost his footing. That's what happens when we focus more on trying to control the outcome than on trusting the one who holds the outcome. When you surrender, you shift your focus. You stop worrying about how it will happen and start trusting who is in charge. And when you do that, peace follows. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to figure it all out. You just have to trust that the God who promised is the God who will fulfill. So let go. Release your need for control and rest in the fact that God's plan is better than anything you could ever orchestrate. Because when he moves, you'll see that it was worth the wait. Obedience to God opens doors that striving never will. Too many people are exhausting themselves trying to make things happen in their own strength, chasing opportunities, forcing relationships, and running ahead of God. But there's a difference between striving and obedience. Striving drains you, but obedience positions you. When you obey God, you don't have to chase blessings. Blessings chase you. Look at the life of Peter. He was a fisherman by trade, a man who knew the waters, knew the seasons, and knew the best times to catch fish. But one day, after working all night and catching nothing, Jesus told him, let down your net. Now, Peter had every reason to argue. He had already tried. He was tired. He knew that fishing at that hour didn't make sense. But instead of relying on his own understanding, he obeyed. And the moment he did, the nets filled with fish to the point of breaking. Some of you are working harder than you need to because you're operating in your own strength. You're frustrated because you've tried everything, but nothing is working. But could it be that you're fishing in the wrong place? Could it be that you're moving on your own when God is saying, wait on me? The difference between an empty net and an overflow is simple: obedience. When Joshua and the Israelites faced the walls of Jericho, God didn't tell them to break them down with weapons or strategy. He told them to march. It didn't make sense in the natural, but obedience isn't about logic. It's about trust. And when they followed God's instruction, the walls fell without them even lifting a hand. This is what happens when you stop striving and start listening. When you obey, God does the heavy lifting. He removes obstacles, shifts situations, and creates breakthroughs that human effort could never achieve. But obedience isn't just about getting the blessing. It's about positioning your heart to trust God no matter what. Some of you are hesitating right now. You feel God calling you to step out, to let go, to move in a new direction, but fear is keeping you stuck. You're afraid of what people will think, afraid of failing, afraid of the unknown. But delayed obedience is still disobedience. And the longer you wait, the longer you postpone what God wants to do in your life. Look at Abraham. God told him to leave his home and go to a land that he would show him. No map, no details, just a command, go. And because Abraham obeyed, God made him the father of many nations. He didn't see the full picture, but he moved. That's what faith looks like. Moving when God says move, even when it doesn't make sense. Because when you obey, you step into divine alignment. You step into favor, provision, and supernatural doors that no amount of striving could ever open. So stop trying to force what only God can do. Obey, trust, and watch him move on your behalf. God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't feel like it. We live in a world that thrives on urgency. We want things now, instantly, without delay. But God doesn't operate on human deadlines. He moves according to his divine plan. And when we truly trust him, we learn to rest in his perfect timing. Think about Lazarus. Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus telling him that their brother was sick. They expected him to come immediately to heal Lazarus before it was too late. But Jesus waited. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. From their perspective, he was too late. But from God's perspective, he was right on time. Because Jesus didn't just come to heal Lazarus, he came to resurrect him. Some of you feel like God is late. You've been praying, believing, waiting, but nothing is happening. And the enemy is whispering in your ear. If God was going to do it, he would have done it by now. Maybe it's not for you. Maybe he forgot. But God didn't forget. He's not ignoring you. He's working behind the scenes, preparing something greater than what you asked for. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean nothing is happening. Look at Joseph. He was given a dream at 17, but it took years before he saw it fulfilled. In that waiting season, he went through betrayal, slavery, false accusations, and imprisonment. If anyone had a reason to question God's timing, it was Joseph. But what he didn't realize was that every step, every delay, every hardship was aligning him for destiny. Had he gone straight from the dream to the throne, he wouldn't have been ready. The delays weren't setbacks. They were preparation. Some doors take time to open because they are too heavy for you to push. If you step into something too soon, you won't have the wisdom, the endurance, or the strength to sustain it. But when you trust God's timing, you walk into things fully prepared, fully equipped, and fully covered by his grace. Sarah and Abraham had to learn this lesson too. God promised them a son, but when the years passed and nothing happened, they tried to speed up the process. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham, and Ishmael was born, not as the promise, but as a product of impatience. And yet when the appointed time came, Isaac was born, just as God had said. The delay didn't mean God changed his mind. It simply meant he was waiting for the right moment. Waiting is hard. It tests our faith, but it also refines us. It teaches us to lean on God instead of our own understanding. It develops the character we need for the blessing we are about to receive. And when the promise finally arrives, we realize that it was worth every second of the wait. So, don't lose faith in the waiting. God's timing is never off. His promises never fail. And when he moves, he does it suddenly. Stay ready, because what he has for you is coming right on time.